You're listening to the Fan to Fan podcast, and this is part 2 of our conversation with producer, director, editor Jason Pichonsky. We're talking about 3D films, from classics to the 80s to the present day, 3D technology, and more. Here we go. So you're listening to the Fan to Fan podcast. Today, we're talking to guest producer, director, editor Jason Pichonsky. You have contributed to 3 Dimensions of Terror over at Rue Morgue, over on your website, deathsploitation.com, reflections, ruminations on 3D genre films. And makes sense because you do reviews of modern 3D movies like Resident Evil 3D I saw, Final Destination, Fright Night 3D, also cult classics, the 1961 The Mask, Tales from the Third Dimension, which you also cover on your blog. You've done commentaries for a few movies. You did a commentary for the Kino Lorber release for Treasure of the Four Crowns. And you also were featured on a commentary from 1983's Man Who Wasn't There. To go back to 3D a little bit, because we'll have to talk about The Mask, because you brought that up. But I know a blind spot that we've kind of had is we grew up with some of these 80s 3D films, peripherally aware that there was a golden age of 3D films before that with, was it Moana Beast and Creature of the Black Lagoon? Pete and I had that kind of shared memory. Sometimes in the 80s, the Revenge of the Creature being released, I always remembered it from Son of Svengoolie featuring it just because I'm from Chicago and this is great. And then on top of that, it's in 3D, like doesn't get any better for 6-year-old Bernie at the time. I loved that.
We'll return to tonight's special 3D movie, Revenge of the Creature, in just a moment. In case you might have missed it, here are some instructions on how to adjust your color television set for the best possible 3D effect.
A split-screen pattern is now appearing on your TV set with the right half appearing blue and the left half appearing white. With your 3D glasses on, close or put your hand over your left eye. You'll now be looking at the screen through the blue filter only. Adjust the hue or tint control on your TV set until the split screen becomes a uniform color. Again, covering your left eye, adjust the hue or tint control on your TV set until the split screen becomes a uniform color. This is the proper setting for all color TV viewing and will ensure that you get the best reception of 3-dimensional programming. For best 3D viewing, you should sit at a distance of 6 feet or more from the screen.
Now, back to our movie, Revenge of the Creature. Remember, you must wear your 3D glasses to see the special 3D effect.
With kind of like that cross-section of everything, the blind spot we have is for the technology. We were watching Man Who Wasn't There last night. It's like, oh, I jotted down the note produced in or shot in Optimax 3. And in my mind, I was like, I have no clue what I just wrote down, but I feel like I should document this. I'm wondering if you, Jason, if you're like, oh, I actually know what that is. Just like you were talking about Tony Anthony and had issues with this kind of camera and he was able to flip to that. Like, does that still mean something to you?
Yeah, Optimax 3 was the camera. It's a camera lens, essentially, that goes on top of the camera. It's into the lens port. It doesn't go on top of a lens. That allows the camera to do those 2 different eye views, right? The basics of 3D is you need to separate. You need to have 2 pictures, one for each eye, and your brain fills in the rest and makes it look like it's 3-dimensional. But you have to have those 2 lenses off center by about 2.5 inches in order, because that's where your eyes are at, in order for that effect to kind of work. And you can play around with that and you get different effects and probably eye strain and headaches after a while. But the Optimax 3 system was sort of an upgrade of the system they used to shoot Coming At You with. So the same 3D supervisor, Bill Bukowski, is the man behind that, those 2, but he was actually building on it. Another inventor, Michael Finley, who had actually shot, his lens system was called the SuperTouch system. Bill Bukowski was his assistant. That lens system shot the ones I mentioned before, the Taiwanese, Hong Kong, Kung Fu films, Magnificent Bodyguards, Dynasty, and Revenge of the Shogun Woman. The interesting thing about Michael Finley, he probably would have went on to work on Coming At You, but he was on his way to Cannes, I think, to show some investors his new improved system of SuperTouch. He was planning to take a sky taxi from the Pan Am building, which was just a helicopter that shuttled a small group of people to the airport. And it never made it off the landing pad. Something had buckled with the rotors in the helicopter, and he ended up dying. And I think his system was with them at the time, and it got destroyed.
Oh, wow.
Wow. Yeah.
So Pichonsky basically rebuilt that system for coming at you.
In the 80s, and maybe this was true before that, but there seemed to be some theft going on of like some of these camera systems. Like if I recall, like Friday the 13th Part 3, like Paramount got sued by some company that they had hired to produce the lenses that they shot with, but then they essentially end up taking credit for it or something like that.
But it was another inventor, and his system was used on, I'm trying to remember what film because it was used on another film later on in the decade. Oh no, it was Treasure of the Four Crowns. That's why it's so familiar.
You've seen Raiders, Star Wars, Aliens, and Close Encounters. But you are about to experience a totally new dimension in entertainment. Forged from the wealth of kings, source of the magical powers of good and evil, unleashed in the hands of a madman. Now, 5 daring heroes defy the odds in a deadly quest to capture the greatest prize of them all.
Go for it!
Treasure of the Four Crowns. Ultimate modern adventure. Treasure of the Four Crowns. In Supervision 3D. Coming soon. From Canon Releasing. To blast you out of your seats.
Because Tony didn't want to go with Optimax. I guess he had too many problems with it. There were issues with Optimax too. Can we back up the technology?
Please, yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
Rewind.
Please.
So the 50s era of 3D film was what was called a 2-strip system. So they had 2 cameras, essentially. Pretty much all. There's some exceptions, but pretty much all the films in that era were shot with 2 cameras and then a device in between them that would basically mirrors or polarizers or something that would reflect the images to those cameras, but be able to offset it so that it was 2.5 inches with a different field of view. When those films would play in theaters, the projectionist actually had to run 2 separate projectors as well. And then those would be centered on the screen, and they'd use polarized lenses in front of the system, the projectors. Basically, depending on how the polarizers were set, they would block one eye and then the other eye. That's what the glasses did. So if you're watching actually still, even today, a polarized film, you can kind of play with your glasses and you'll see them go dark in the theater. So that's what happened in the 50s. And by the time it started getting used again in the 60s, people were starting to develop systems where they could use one strip of film and one camera. And then the device that goes in front of the lens would split a typical Academy frame, which is sort of like a square frame. It would split it in half. So that's why you get really wide. If you watch those films, almost all of those films are really wide screen films because it's kind of like Technoscope where it's split the screen in half and one. So the system was called over and under. And one would have your right eye on the top and the bottom might have the left eye. And then another device went in front of the projector and split those back up into the screen. And the same sort of thing would happen with the polarizers.
Well, I think it's wild to think, because now I think people go to the movies and then just like, I think much of it, if not all of it, is automated. But there was a real pressure might not be the right word, but there was a real responsibility on cinemas and projectionists to kind of set, especially when it was like in the 50s with the 2 camera thing, to kind of set that up so that people weren't running from the theater with migraine headaches, which apparently did still happen a lot, because it sounds like technology-wise, that seemed to be there was a pretty fine line of having to have that set up properly.
Yeah, well, you had to have those projectors running completely in sync so that the right frames were lined up together. And it wasn't even that. There's also blades in the projector that spin around, and those had to be in sync as well, because if those were a little bit off, you might end up with not a full frame off, slight frames off, like, because it's kind of flashing more than it's actually playing. It's 24 frames per second, but with the blades, it might actually be coming off and on even faster than that. Certainly it is digitally now. Yeah, so if any of that's off, or if you have it misaligned at all, your brain can fuse it, but eventually you're going to get eye strain. Because if you're able to track it, because some people aren't, some people it's just right away, it just is a mess and they won't get any 3D. But if your eyes are something that can do that easily, they're not going to notice that they're sort of one's looking up and one's looking down. And that's effectively what's sort of happening. And yeah, you get a headache.
On Friday, August 13th, join Jason in his woods, if you dare. Friday the 13th, Part 3 in Super 3D. Jason, you can't fight him, you can't stop him, and now you can't even keep him on the screen. Friday the 13th, Part 3 in Super 3D. A new dimension in terror from Paramount Pictures, rated R, under 17, not admitted without parent.
I saw Friday the 13th in a theater 15 years ago or more, and I'd been watching it at home, and I couldn't. It wasn't set up right, and my eyes couldn't fuse it, so I left. I didn't. I'll just watch it at home. Maybe it brings me to how I got into 3D in the first place, or I mean, I was just interested in 3D. You know, when the 80s wave happened, I was too young to actually go see a lot of these films. Too young, and I grew up in a very small community, and to get to the nearest movie theater was a half an hour drive, and I was too young to drive, at least. So I didn't see a lot of these in the theater at the time. I really remember the a pseudo-Canadian production, Space Hunter. I remember that one and talking to my science teacher about it and being really sad that I didn't get to see Molly Ringwald in 3D.
There was a young Pete Charbonneau who was into theater.
You saw it in 3D, right?
I did. I saw that and Metal Storm, The Destruction of Jared Sin, both of those in the theater. We've discussed these on the podcast, but I even at the time, I remember feeling really ripped off by Metal Storm because there's no destruction of Jared Sin. And when that movie ended, I'm like, what? There's not more 20 more minutes? What's going on? I remember enjoying them, but again, being a child of Star Wars in the 70s and seeing that in the drive-in in my pajamas, you know, as I've said this, like, you know, I didn't go home after seeing those and go play, you know, Space Hunter in the woods across the street from my home. So it didn't have that big of an effect, but
no.
I was still loving the fact that all these movies that were spawned from Star Wars were out there. You know, yes, I think even at the time I was a small kid, I understood they were second rate, but I had a wild, active imagination, so I was on board. Like when I watch it now, I'm like these sets are atrocious, but at the time I was just like, oh yeah, of course they're on some post-apocalyptic world. Yeah, I get it. I'm on board. So they served their purpose for me at the time.
In lieu of no Star Wars, you'll take a poor man's Star Crash. So thank you, Mr. Corman. Absolutely, 100%.
That was a Laserdisc you held up?
Yep.
Because this feeds into my rediscovery of 3D. Because as a kid, I was also very much into Viewmasters, right? And the 3D that they have.
Sure, yeah.
So I discovered in 2000 that in Japan, before the Laserdisc, there was like the CDs. What are the other ones called? Where they were basically like a record inside a case.
Mm-hmm.
That was sort of the earliest. That was, I think, even before VHS tape. Or no, it would have been competing with VHS tape. Japan had a version that actually had stereoscopic or 3D capabilities. So a lot of these films had been released in Japan on these CDs. No, the VHDs. CED is what the non-3D American versions were called. You could buy shutter glasses and you could watch it on old analog TVs, and it would basically split the fields that are being broadcast. So very similar, but the resolution was really low. And at the time, the internet was just coming up, and you could find collectors groups and people that were selling videotape versions of these, like copies. That's when I started watching 3D films. And a lot of them are getting released finally, which has kind of been great.
I mean, other than your unfortunately poor experience with Friday the 13th in the theater, have you been able to catch any of these rerun in theaters or at conventions or anything like that?
Back in about the same time as I saw the Friday the 13th, one of the little smaller cinemas here were doing sort of a retrospective of 3D. So I managed to see quite a few. And then there have been 3D festivals, unfortunately, in LA and New York. But I did drag myself out to LA one year. They did 3 of them. They were the annual film expo, 3D film expo.
Yeah, I saw you put on your blog. It was 2003 was the first World 3D Film Expo. You called it the Lollapalooza for movie geeks.
Yeah.
Was that one of the few gatherings that you're aware of that are celebration and also showing of 3D films?
That was sort of the first big one that I'm aware of. I think a lot of that falls on a man named Robert Furmanek. He is actually one of the people behind most of these Blu-ray releases, 3D film releases that have been coming out. He's had a mission sort of to restore 3D films for a while now. His sort of love is those Golden Age films. So Treasure of the Four Crowns was something that they'd actually done. Man Who Wasn't There as well. So there I managed to see quite a few. It was really focused on the 50s, but I did manage to see most of the catalog that kind of exists on film.
Was that around the time when you discovered The Mask for the first time, or had you been aware of that prior to that?
Well, The Mask I've been aware of because A, it was a horror film, considered Canada's first horror film, and I was writing for a horror magazine at the time.
What is this all about?
Well, look at it. Can't you feel it?
Feel what?
Don't talk. No words. Just hold me.
No. Now.
So soft.
Alan, I can't breathe.
So alive.
It's hurting me.
Don't talk.
I can't breathe.
What is it that haunts our sleep?
No.
Creeps upon us in the shadows. What stranger knocks, comes visiting late in the night? Come, share the world of the living dead. Partners trapped in evil. The eyes of hell takes you right out of your seat through the magic of 3D. Unmasks the secret fears, the hidden terrors of lovers. Eyes of hell. Come, look into the eyes of hell. You will never get over the magic of 3D, the weird world of unbelievable terror. A new dimension of diabolical thrills. Come, plunge into horror through the magic of 3D. Come deep into the eyes of hell.
I'd actually managed to interview the director's son. So that's when I really first became aware of it. It's come a long way because it was this weird outlier in 3D film where it's mostly in 2D, but there's 3 sequences in 3D, right? And at the time when it was released, by then the 50s age of 2-projector 3D had kind of disappeared, and the theaters had gotten rid of their projectors and all of their equipment, so you couldn't really show a traditional 3D film 50s era 2-strip. But what you could do is you could do it in anaglyph, and The Mask was in black and white, so it didn't really matter. So anaglyph is just, instead of using polarized lenses, you use colored lenses, and you are able on one frame of film to squeeze the 2 images in, and one's printed red, one's printed cyan, and the opposite colors cancel that out. So that's how it kind of existed. And The Mask is still, people who know things, who write about, well, not who know things about 3D, but who write about 3D and stuff, and who saw it at the time. It's considered one of the best animated films ever made.
I wanted to go back, Jason, something you said earlier on 80s 3D production. And I'm wondering if it's fair to say that like the group of people that were involved in developing the technology, it sounds like it was a small group of people that were working on this, developing it, sharing it with other productions, maybe sharing it amongst themselves. Is that fair to say?
I think there were like a few groups of people. I think they were going out of their way not to share it with each other. There was some fights and tips over it.
Got it.
Yeah, there certainly was like a small, like 4 or 5 people.
Okay.
Immediate, like they get the credit for
the big developments and kind of into technology, making it practical, putting it in theaters.
Yeah. Chris Condon was one of the inventors of one of the devices that did the over-under. He's basically was the guy that supplied all the lenses to Earl Owensby. And another guy named Lenny Lipton, who is, I think he did some of his own versions of lenses, but he was more of kind of an acolyte of Condon. He actually was actually the on-set guy for Owensby. So he's one guy. Finley and Pichonsky is another guy. The Marx Deepix, which was used on Treasure, was a couple of brothers that had been around since the 50s, sort of dabbling in the 3D. I think in the 50s, they had done quite well producing glasses for the screenings. I can't remember their name. I think, their last name is Mortimer. Mortimer Marx is sort of the guy that was responsible for that one. But yeah, this more of I don't have any notes. So
yeah, no, it's okay.
I don't want to get too much wrong.
No, it's just names that I think Pete and I have kind of seen. Like when he said Condon, I was like, oh, we've totally seen him. And when you mentioned earlier, Revenge of the Shogun Women, there was an interview I was reading online because there was a 3D showing somewhere in the Midwest, and one of the featured guests was Worth Keeter. And the guy who was writing about it was saying how, very few people knew that he had directed these movies for Earl Owensby, but that, when you kind of look at it per capita, like he's involved with a lot of 3D productions from the 80s that are not Jaws 3D or the movies that are kind of like put first and foremost in that category. And I guess it was before Friday the 13th was made, Steve Miner, who was the director of the first Friday, was talking with Keeter and was saying, hey, we're going to shoot this in 3D, but we may have some issues. The anecdote the guy was saying that Worth Keeter, I guess, shared at the showing was like, yeah, so I said, all right, well, this is Worth talking. He's like, well, let me see the copy of the script. And I guess Steve Miner be like, are you kidding? If we had the script, we'd be shooting now. Like, no, like we're not that far ahead. Like, I can't help you. But then the practical implications, I guess, the production for Friday the 13th 3D suffered some delays because, they couldn't get the technical side to make sense on the 3D production. So, but again, like the name seems like, it seems like there's a small group of folks that were involved in this. And again, what you said makes sense. It's proprietary. You're protective about what you make. Maybe one person says, hey, I'm not getting enough. So they make their own studio or, I'm assuming a lot of that stuff is happening.
Yeah. Well, and it wasn't really an industry, right? It was starting to become an industry in the 50s, and within 2 years, it kind of disappeared, 2.5 years. So you didn't have a lot of people getting into it. It's the people that were in it at the time. The same with the 80s. It really sort of petered out very quickly. Mm-hmm. They were the people that were always like preaching the gospel of 3D. And if you look at a lot of the first films they did look really cheap because they are, but the technology that they're using was very sophisticated, but they didn't have the money for the lighting and the budgets. And there's a film called The Stewardesses, which is another group that made the film, and it's kind of like it gets remembered a lot as being sort of one of those 3D films, sort of an erotic film. It's very soft core, but
just for the record, Jason, the background is appreciated. Thank you. This has actually been really helpful. Just knowing that there's someone out there that actually like the gaps you're filling in, these names that you're just throwing out there kind of like off the cuff. It's like, oh, cool, we saw Jaws 3D. And now we see some connections with Worth Keeter and Earl Owensby and now Tony Anthony. Like these names mean something to us, but even something like Condit and Optimax, these are all part of this very small group of people that you said are not in industry, but, are innovative. And, for blips on the cinematic radar in the 50s and the 80s and in the early aughts, put asses in the seats.
The quality of the films, the stewardesses made a lot of money. The whole adult industry was sort of starting up. It is the most amateurish looking film. The lighting's not great, but the 3D is really amazing. So it was like a proof of concept for the 3D system. That was kind of its reason to be.
I don't know if you've spoken to any of these people or have any knowledge, but especially with the 80s, I think it probably happened in the 50s and 60s too. A lot of the 3D movies get so derided, and I think a lot of that comes from the quality. And then I think the actual 3D aspects of it get lumped in with that, because then it's like, well, it's just a gimmick, and what is it enhancing the movie to? It seems to have there's such a negative connotation amongst like the general public and general with critics and things like that. I have to imagine like these people are putting their heart and soul into making this, into developing the technology, and so that's got to sting, I would think, to be like, well, we're just here's a problem that they're trying to solve, like going from with the 50s where you needed a 2-camera system to be like, okay, well, how can we get that into 1 camera? So we're eliminating the headaches, the literal and figurative headaches, and they're just like trying to solve it and create a better experience, but to kind of get grouped into this just overall negative, like, oh, 80s 3D movies, oh, they're terrible. And it's, have you spoken to any of the people that were involved? Any thoughts on that?
There aren't too many people that were involved in those eras that are left from the 3D side. I think a lot of them knew what they were working on it was exploitive, and it was sort of made to make money, and they were using the 3D as a gimmick. But I think what they were hoping was that getting these out there would bring more prestige projects, which in the 80s never really happened. A lot of them are fun. They're really fun movies, especially if you like if you like sort of genre stuff. It's not all exploitation. But there were a lot of prestige pictures. Right? In the 50s, there were. And there's some great pictures in the 50s that weren't even really necessarily genre films. The Rita Hayworth film was really good, and that was just sort of a drama.
Do you really believe in the perfect murder?
Yes, absolutely. On paper, that is. But I doubt if I could carry it out. Oh? Why not? Well, because in stories, things usually turn out the way the author wants them to, and in real life, they don't.
You're trying to blackmail me into murdering your wife?
So didn't Hitchcock, one of the Hitchcock films...
Hitchcock made Dial M for Murder.
Dial M for Murder.
It's good. It's a good film. It didn't really play at the time. I don't think it really had any bookings in 3D, or maybe a few.
I always remember that story with Hitchcock where I think it was reading some anecdote about Tony Anthony and how he saw maybe like a showing of that in 3D somewhere in San Francisco, and that also helped in kind of like motivating him to make Coming at You in 3D. And I'm just wondering if there was like a resurgence at that time where, they're taking all of these 50s, 60s 3D films that are now midnight showings or something going on in mid to late 70s.
Well, there were like a handful of films that were getting made mostly overseas. It was the 80s was when there was a few re-releases of like Creature, and I can't off the top of my head, I can't remember, but they re-released maybe in the late 70s. They did Anaglyph, because there was an Anaglyph version of Creature from the Black Lagoon, and it came from outer space. Those might have been prior to 1980. Then you get all the Anaglyph versions that started to show up on TV in the 80s, in like 82, right? 83.
That was my gateway. That was what Bernie and I always remembered, was the Creature from the Black Lagoon. And I think The Mask actually had a TV. I don't remember. It was after Creature from the Black Lagoon, but it was definitely early 80s. It's the same thing. Like, go do we had 7-Eleven in New York. Go to 7-Eleven, buy a Slurpee or Icy, get your 3D glasses, and then Friday night at 8, we'll put this on. And that was my first introduction to 3D, and being very underwhelmed with the TV.
I was going to ask, how did it work for you? Because I remember 50s film called Gorilla at Large.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Playing that way. And I was excited for days to see that. And I couldn't get it to work.
I remember the TV experience being very underwhelming, but the idea of it, I loved so much. And I remember having like picture books that had the anaglyph, glasses that you could look. And I remember that, the books like popping out at me, looking at that. So I was fascinated by the experience. So I think when stuff like Space Hunter came around, I was like begging my dad to take me to see it, because it's like, well, I gotta, movie in space, and it's gonna be like leaping out at the screen. And again, like overactive imagination. Like I'm picturing literally like looking around the theater and just seeing stuff moving around me, which would, I guess, kind of come later in the 90s when you'd have like the full headset on. But I remember being over at my friend Eddie Ciervo's house for Creature of the Black Lagoon. We had our 3D glasses, made a bunch of popcorn with his brothers, and it came on, and we're just like, that's it.
Coming soon to a television set near you, Gorilla at Large in 3D. Get your 3D glasses at IGA food stores and Shop and Go, and be watching for Gorilla at Large.
Mark your calendar for Sunday night, September 12th. WTOC TV will present a special 3D movie, Gorilla at Large. See him swing right into your living room. See him run off with your women. Hey, nice elbow chop. See him climb your roller coaster. Get a load of that fancy footwork. See all this and more in 3D on color sets with these special 3D glasses, available only at your nearby Shop and Go or IGA food store at 2 for 99 cents. So get your official glasses at Shop and Go or IGA and be watching Sunday, September 12th for Gorilla at Large.
We had talked to a bunch of people, too, about their 3D memories. And John, who grew up with Pete on Long Island, remembered Gorilla at Large, Jason. And he was saying kind of same sentiment. He's like, I remember super excited to watch this movie. And then you watch it and you're like, that's it. And I think when he was talking about it, I was able to find a few, I think the big channel there, Pix, that Pete grew up on. It's like their station bumper, like Pix. That's what you find it on YouTube. You'll see that. It's like a little earworm. And I found like an Elvira promo. And I think, it's like a summer where they were airing a bunch of 3D films that were, certainly from like the 50s and 60s releases. I think one of them may have been The Mask, but
there is a Mask VHS that she hosted. I don't know if that was the television version. There was a television version that was produced that Julian Rothman, the director, who directed it in 1961, came back in the 80s and shot this wraparound stuff with Harry Blackstone.
Thank you, Jimmy. Oh, and one other thing. You must remember to sit at least 6 feet back from the screen for the best results. And then we'll show you what we mean by magical 3-dimension.
They're almost walking the audience on how 3D works, and they're kind of dispelling all the myths about, it giving you headaches and everything. And it just reminded me again, when we first started the conversation, I'd shown Pete like this maybe 10-minute documentary that we found that also felt like it was from the 50s. This guy who's walking the audience through the experience of what 3D technology is. Stereotypical over the time housewife comes in and says, but won't I get dizzy? And he's like, oh, well, let's talk to Dr. Smith. And he'll explain to us how this technology works. Well, would this make me blind? The fact that all of that exists is, it's so interesting to me, because the fact that we now, like you were kind of making the point, Jason, it's so synonymous that the technology is with genre fare. Cult classics, forgotten classics, but to go from Hondo, which I saw was released in 3D, to then like Creature from the Black Lagoon, like you mentioned in Anaglyph, and I think that was like 54, further along in the Universal Monsters heyday, but still in the Mount Rushmore of Universal Monsters.
Now, it wasn't released in Anaglyph at the time.
Much later, right?
It was polarized. Yep. It's a fabulous movie in 3D.
Mm-hmm. It's just interesting, the cross-section of, I think I even saw some Mickey Spillane 3D stuff on your blog. It's like,
I the jury, and we can watch that now because that's been restored.
Yeah.
The problem is now we're getting these 3D Blu-ray discs coming out of all these sort of lost, almost forgotten 3D.
And you can't do the commentary on all of them. Is that the problem?
No, that's not the problem. There's people that know way more about 50s fare than I do. But they've stopped making the TVs that are able to watch this stuff, right? They were like, when the first Avatar came out, everybody was behind it. The TV manufacturers were behind it. And they've stopped incorporating it into their televisions. You can still buy projectors, though. That's a plus. It's still available for anybody that's sort of new to it that wants to get into 3D.
Well, I was going to ask you, Jason, to kind of wrap up. It seems like you have a setup in your home where you get to enjoy some of these movies in legitimate 3D. Do you have a top 3 3D movies that, you're like,
think about this beforehand?
That's what we try to do. Put you on the spot. There have to be some that maybe get more of a spin, a watch.
We'll allow some honorable mentions if you can't.
1,000%. Yes. Yeah.
I guess ones that I like, it might be more than 3. For the 50s, I mean, I like horror films. So House of Wax is amazing. Vincent Price is just amazing. But House of Wax, I've watched a lot because it was one of the first tapes that I got as well. So I watched it like old school analog televisions. And I still watch it to this day. Creature from the Black Lagoon, a Paul Morrissey film called Flesh for Frankenstein with Udo Kier in it. I don't know. There's something hypnotic about Udo Kier's voice and the extremeness of the film. The Mask is certainly on there. Well, coming at you before probably Treasure of the Four Crowns for me, for Tony Anthony. So that's a short list. It's really genre-y.
Nothing wrong with that. Are you kidding? We're talking about 3D because these genre movies made such an impression. So no disparagement there at all.
Yeah, and we've certainly enjoyed, like Bernie was saying, like discovering some of this stuff, like Silent Madness. We thought was incredibly solid for a slasher for what it was, but again, another one that was like just was completely off our radar.
Now, are you guys watching this stuff in 3D?
No.
We are not.
Oh,
no, I was waiting. I was waiting for that, Jason. I was waiting for.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, we at some point I would love to, but yeah, we're just kind of to be completists right now, and so that we could talk about, because we've done a run of like trying to watch every 80s 3D movie that we could get our hands on, and getting our hands on at times, sometimes just like really poor YouTube copies that but it still has the tracking on on it, but just to say that we've seen it and so we can comment on it. But yeah, in the future, would love to see some of these in 3D.
Oh, well, you bring up Silent Madness. I've had a tape of Silent Madness for a long time in my collection in the old version, 3D, and it never really left much of an impression on me. And this newer Blu-ray, that watching it in my proper setup, it was like, this is way better than I could remember.
I think that was our experience. It wasn't like it was like the greatest film ever, but like I think we went in with such low expectations, and I'm like, oh no, this actually looks really good. And then didn't do the research. I think it was the same cinematographer that did Friday the 13th Part 3, because I'm like, it looks like it was basically shot at the same time. It just has like the same quality to it. And so I think we were just really impressed that it looked as good as it did. Like the acting was serviceable. And it otherwise was forgotten by so many people, including us. And so we're just kind of like, how did this one, miss us all for all these years?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it didn't get much sort of release, right? It didn't really exist on home video. Overlooked like a lot of stuff. It's oddly sort of starting to bubble to the surface and getting little releases now. And there's some gems that come out.
Best part of this podcast, I think, having conversations with folks like you that appreciate the stuff, that certainly know more about either this moment in time, 3D, Canadian productions than Pete and I do, so we can fill in some gaps. Because I think, for, cult classics, forgotten classics, genre fare, I think you could probably argue I've maybe watched Walter Hill's The Warriors more times than I've watched Citizen Kane. Like when I look at my shelf, I'm like, I see where the dust is. And I'm like, I love Gone with the Wind, but man, I think I've watched American Ninja 2 more times than Gone with the Wind. So, nothing against Gone with the Wind, but there's just some of these films that just leave an impression on you. And Pete and I growing up watching these, I mean, the fact, Jason, that we don't disparage the name of Metal Storm by just calling it Metal Storm. We have to call it Metal Storm: The Destruction of Jared Sin. With
we're legally obliged.
Legally obliged, yes. Just because they're like, let's at least be respectful, even though there's very little destruction. Let's at least be respectful to those people. So we'll wrap it up with Mr. Anthony. If you're listening, reach out to Jason, reach out to us. We're happy to discuss because we can't talk about it coming at you too much. So we're happy to talk about it very much. So thanks, Jason, man. Very much appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Enjoyed it.
Appreciate it.